Yes.
Professor Ludlam,
just
yes.
Before you start, could I say a couple of things? Firstly, Sir Brian asked me about how we might change therapy if, having discovered that concentrates caused immune depression, separate from viral infections. I didn't answer that question. I'm sorry, the discussion moved on. The answer is that there was a move to produce purer concentrates. The factor VIII concentrates produced in the early 1980s were very impure. They contained a lot of fibrinogen, immunoglobulins, fibronectin, all sorts of other proteins. The amount of factor VIII was minuscule, if I can put it that way. And in the later 1980s, or the mid to late 1980s, the move was to produce much purer, much more refined concentrates that had many fewer of these impurities in. There were a number of advantages in such concentrates. They were easier to mix up. There was a view, not supported by very much evidence, but a view that possibly impure concentrates would cause immune decline in those infected with HIV more rapidly. If the concentrates were impure, that they would cause the CD4 counts to go down more rapidly, and therefore patients develop AIDS more quickly. And there was a move for that reason to produce purer concentrates. The evidence was pretty flimsy, but people were very keen to give every opportunity for patients to get the best possible treatment, and that's why there was a move towards high purity, and particularly in the late 80s, early 90s. I realise I hadn't responded to your question, but that's the drift of where we were moving.
Well, thank you very much for that. I too realised over the break that you hadn't answered that particular part of the question, so thank you very much.
Pleasure. Ms. Richards, if I might just say I had reflected on why I had asked for ethical approval for the skin tests, but not for the lymphocyte tests. And as you saw this morning, I had to think about it, and I've been thinking about it over lunch a little further. And I think it was because the skin tests had not been previously carried out in people with haemophilia. So it was a rather more speculative investigation. And I think for that reason, I would probably have applied for ethical approval, as well as it being an invasive investigation.
Thank you.
I hope that helped.
Most of the rest of the questions I'm going to be asking you, Professor, are questions which I've been invited to ask by various core participants. I mention that just because we may leap around from topic to topic and come back to some topics as a result of that. At the time when the patients at the Edinburgh Centre received the implicated batch in the spring of 1984, did you have available to you a heat-treated product for clinical trial?
Yeah.
What use did you make of a heat-treated products in 1983 or 1984?
We assessed, it might have been 2 different concentrates that PFC were developing at that time. I think there were, if I can put it this way, phase 1 infusions of a couple of products.
And how many of your patients in 83 or 84, prior to December 84, did you, as far as you're able to recall, did you treat with some form of heat-treated product?
None of them were treated with a heat-treated product. These were test infusions. to assess how the patient responded to them.
In December 1984, at the meeting that you've told us about, I think you've indicated that patients were told that they were now going to be receiving a heat-treated product that was understood to be safe in terms of transmission of HTLV3. How was it known in December 1984 that the new NY product was safe vis-a-vis HTLV3?
I didn't say that it would be safe. I said it was being treated and we hoped it would be safer. So there was no guarantee that it would not transmit the HTLV3.
Had there been clinical trials of NY at that point?
There had been no clinical, no. It had only been heat treated the previous month after the publication of the Cutter and Jay Levy's work from San Francisco on mouse retroviruses.
So, is this right? It was hoped that it would not be infective, but there had been little, if any, by way of testing or trialling that would establish that.
That's correct, yes.
In terms of the AIDS study that we were talking about before lunch, were all of the Edinburgh cohort who were subsequently infected part of the AIDS study?
I know that a goodly number had their lymphocyte subsets measured prior to being exposed to the presumed infected batch, because they all had severe haemophilia and therefore were frequent or relatively frequent attenders at the centre.
So is it right that none of those patients who were part of the AIDS study were given a heat-treated product prior to December 1984?
No, it is. No, though I'm thinking of one particular individual who had was kind enough to allow us to treat him. The test dose of one of the heat-treated concentrates is very likely we had T-cell subsets on him. Sorry, was that your question?
Yes, I think so.
The other thing is that there were 4 patients treated in November 1984 with the SMBTS NY that had been treated at 68 degrees for 2 hours to check that there weren't going to be any immediate adverse effects from the treatment.
We looked on Tuesday, I think it was, at a letter you'd written to Dr. Krask in 1980, which described the patients at the Edinburgh Centre as being an almost unique group. And you'll recall that's also the letter with the phrase in about being useful material. I think subsequently it's been reported, described that this was a unique group of haemophiliacs. I think you've used phrases in correspondence or publications about them having been very carefully followed up, close monitoring, and they've been described as one of the most extensively studied groups of HIV-infected individuals in the world. Patients who were infected in 1984, who may have learnt subsequently that they were participants in something called an AIDS study in 1983, have, as I'm sure you are aware, raised concerns or expressed the belief that they were somehow deliberately infected for the purpose of research. Do you understand how and why they may have come to that view? And do you have any observations to make about it?
Thank you for asking me, because I do have an observation to make about it. I understand how the shortcut of writing age study on a form then might have been misinterpreted when seen by the patient subsequently. What I would say is, I think it's very regrettable that the patient didn't either raise with me the question or complain to the hospital about what their suspicions were, because I would have been able to explain to them what I perceived to be the true situation that we were talking about before lunch. And I hope that would have satisfied the patient's concern. If they weren't happy with my explanation, if they had complained to the hospital would have taken it very seriously. It was clearly a very serious allegation. And a meeting would have been arranged, as happens with all complaints by patients, in which there would have been an independent chairperson. The patient perhaps might have wanted to come with a supporter, a spouse, or partner, or any other friend. And the questions would have been put to me, and I could have answered and explained what had happened. If the patient, then having heard the explanation from me twice, still felt I was not giving them the true information, then agreed it could be taken to further external authority, like, for example, the General Medical Council. The problem with complaining to the General Medical Council in those days was that it was then impossible for me to meet with the patient to explain, to offer an explanation. And so I submitted to the General Medical Council a report as to what had happened, what about the lymphocyte subset testing and so on, and then how the infected batch had been identified. The whole history was laid out to the General Medical Council. I assumed that had been passed to the patient in response to the complaints, because I responded to the written complaints that the patient had made to the GMC. So I replied to those complaints. I did my best to address them. And I was horrified to learn recently, as a result of the inquiry asking the GMC how it had handled a complaint, I was horrified to learn that my response to the patient's complaints had never been forwarded to him. I was appalled at that. So the patient then was left not having learnt how I responded to his complaint. I think that's absolutely appalling. And the patient didn't want to approach me, thought that I wouldn't provide the information. So I hope it's all right for me to say here that I have made available to the patient my response to the GMC along with its appendices that I had assumed had been sent to him 15 years ago. What I should say that the GMC arrangements now, I think, are different. They now there's now better liaison and an initial assessment of the patient's complaints and making sure that they are appropriately addressed. But I'm appalled by what has transpired over the last almost 20 years in relation to this patient's very legitimate anxiety about what the AIDS study was. I appreciate it. The details were laid out in the Penrose inquiry, but then the patient shouldn't have to read Penrose report in order to get a response to his anxieties. Does that help?
Yes, I may come back to some broader questions about the impact of events on doctor-patient relationships, but I'm going to move now to a separate topic. If we could have, please, ARCH 303312_020, please. We can see this is a note of a meeting held on the 10th of February 2000 to discuss the information required to assist in the examination of the circumstances surrounding the safety of SNBTS blood products from hepatitis C. And we can see in terms of the list of attendees, there are various, as it were, government representatives, including Dr. Keel, who I think is there in the capacity of being Deputy Chief Medical Officer, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And then there are a number of clinicians present, Haemophilia Centre directors present, including yourself. And if we look at the first paragraph, so if we just go slightly further down the page, please, Shumik. Paragraph 1 says, Ms. Teal opened the meeting with introductions and apologies and explained the background to the request for information from the Haemophilia directors. She outlined the Minister's meeting with the Haemophilia Society and the Minister's undertaking to examine the circumstances surrounding the safety of SNBTS products from hepatitis C, with particular reference to the Society's claim that Scottish patients were exposed to HCV longer than patients in England were. So that was the purpose of the meeting, Professor. There's then some exchange of information about potential numbers infected, which I'm not going to ask you to look at. But if we could go to page 4. We look at paragraph 9, it records this. Professor Lowe pointed out that most patients would have been infected while their predecessors were in post and asked whether it was necessary to contact them to make them aware of the situation. Mrs. Towers explained that this was a factual information gathering exercise, but it should be borne in mind that the information might be used in future court actions. Professor Ludlam also sought advice on whether haemophilia directors should be looking back to try to identify what had happened to patients whose whereabouts and status were unknown. Mrs. Towers confirmed that the Central Legal Office was representing the trusts and SNBTS, and that the haemophilia directors should therefore follow Central Legal Office advice on whether any further investigation or the tracking down of patients was necessary. As I understand this paragraph, or the summary of the discussion that's in this paragraph, Professor Lowe, and then in particular you, were raising the question of whether there was action that you should be taking to undertake some form of look back and try and find out if there were patients who may have been treated in the past so that they could be tested for hepatitis C and presumably receive treatment. Is that right?
I think that's correct, yes.
Now, what this appears to suggest to say is you're being told by those who are there representing the NHS and government in Scotland that that's something for the Central Legal Office to decide, and there appears to be a concern that information might be used in future court actions. Do you understand what that concern was?
I don't know whether it was triggered by the episode of non-A, non-B hepatitis experienced by a patient in Edinburgh in 1986, or whether this was a more general. I'm sorry, I can't. I don't quite understand why the CLO would have reservations about doing this, because it would be in potentially in the patient's interests.
Yes, you're suggesting, if I can put it colloquially, the right thing to do for patients, and you're being told that the haemophilia directors should follow Central Legal Office's advice on whether there should be any further tracking down of patients. Do you know what happened after this?
I don't recall getting any advice from the CLO in relation to this matter. And in fact, there was a very full survey carried out in Scotland, published in, I think, 2013 by Dr. Khan from, he and Professor Watson led this from Aberdeen, in which they looked at patients who had, if I can put it this way, at some stage lived in Scotland who had haemophilia, and what had become of them, and what treatment they had received, and whether they had responded to the interferon and ribavirin therapy, which was the best that was available at the time. The situation obviously is now very different, but there was this very comprehensive, a very carefully conducted study from Aberdeen on behalf of Haemophilia Directors in Scotland to try and address some of this.
That's, with respect, Professor, 13 years later, because this meeting is in 2000. Do I understand from your evidence that whether or not you received further advice from the Central Legal Office, that you yourself did not take any action at that stage to try and identify what had happened to patients whose whereabouts and status was unknown?
Oh, well, status, any patient who was attending the centre would be, when they were reviewed annually, part of that review would be to see whether they had been tested for hepatitis C. I think we would have looked back, I'm sure we looked back through our files of people who had moved on, and depending a bit on who they were, or at least what kind of haemophilia they had, and where they had gone, we might have contacted, if we had a follow-up address for them, then we might have been in touch with them. It was certainly something we thought about but we didn't keep complete records of absolutely everyone who came through our door, easily obtainable.
Yes. I mean, it does look as though what you're proposing here is something more proactive and potentially extensive by way of a look-back exercise. Is it right to understand that wasn't done until a number of years later with the exercise that you've described from Aberdeen?
I think each haemophilia centre adopted a similar policy to what I have described. I think what the Khan paper also reviewed was how patients had responded to different therapies that were being used during the previous decade or so. It was to bring together, if you like, the Scottish experience and to stimulate further inquiry in case there were other patients who, if I can put it this way, hadn't been traced or could be traced and hadn't been.
May I just ask, Ms. Richards, what was the capacity in which Mrs. Towers was present?
We've asked that, sir, now that if we go back to the first page. Scottish Executive Solicitor's Office.
Yes, so she was legal,
yes,
in effect. So if we go back to where we just were, please.
So on to page 4 again. Thank
you. This is a lawyer hinting strongly, it might be thought, but we'll have to see what is said, that there shouldn't, or there should be great care in gathering facts, because in some way future court actions might be affected.
That appears to be what it says.
Yes. I see.
Yes, and so we may need to make inquiries elsewhere in relation to that.
Yes, well, better I say nothing more about that at the moment.
Professor Ludlam, I'm going to ask you now to look at another document on a completely different topic, HCDO 40-271_101. Sure. HCDO 40-271_101. Professor, I'm going to ask you to look at 4 documents which are on the same topic and then ask you some questions about it. It's about a proposal for there to be data gathering about the HTLV3 status of sexual partners and household contacts. So this is a letter from Dr. Forbes, or Professor Forbes in his capacity as chair of the Haemophilia Directors AIDS Committee. This letter's not dated, but I think it's about August of 1985, I think probably from other information. And you'll see it's addressed to centre directors. The response to our request for anti-HTLV3 results on individual haemophiliacs has been very gratifying, and there's going to be a report. The next paragraph says we decided to ask centre directors to let us have data on the anti-HTLV3 status of regular sexual partners, of patients who are both anti-HTLV3 positive and negative. We should also like any results on other household members other than sexual contacts, again, of both anti-HTLV3 positive and negative patients. And then there's a request for brief details if any of those family members have clinical manifestations likely to be due to HTLV3. And then it says you may not have tested all sexual contacts or household members, but any results that are available will be most useful. The results will be important as an estimate of the transmissibility of HTLV3. So that's the request that went out from Dr. Forbes, Professor Forbes. If we then go to HCDO 40-271_088, please. This is a reply from Dr. Peter Jones, or a letter from Dr. Peter Jones to Dr. Forbes, 22nd of October 1985. He refers to at the last reference centre directors meeting, we agreed a formal protocol be drawn up, so we knew exactly what we were looking for in this proposed study. I should have said the letters headed Sexual and Household Survey. At the meeting yesterday, a form very similar to the one I had raised objections to in London was again presented by Chris Ludlam without a protocol. I didn't want to say too much at the meeting, but I'm now writing to you formally to say that in its present form, it's my opinion that the questionnaire that you intend to circulate to all haemophilia centre directors is unethical. It could be construed as a breach of human rights. This is a very sensitive and delicate area, and the suggestion that any information concerning the sexual lives of our patients and their families be collected centrally will, I think, meet with a reaction which will do untold harm. I'm as aware as anyone of the need for as much factual information as we can gather about HTLV3 disease, but do not think that the people who are putting up this project have thought it through adequately. Until we've had a chance to discuss a proper protocol, I must ask you not to circulate any forms requiring either the names or numbers of the sexual partners of haemophiliacs to the directors. So that's Dr. Jones, October 1985. Third document, Professor Ludlam, it's dated a week or so later. It's HCDO 40271_096. So we can see it's the 30th of October 1985, and it's a letter from Dr. Forbes to directors on the same topic, a survey of the HTLV3 status of the contacts of haemophiliacs. There is much public anxiety about the transmission of HTLV3 between individuals. To investigate this further, we're asking centre directors if they would like to participate in a study to assess the anti-HTLV3 status of household and sexual contacts of haemophilic patients. It is suggested that these contacts of haemophiliacs should be studied, whether the haemophiliacs are anti-HTLV3 positive or negative. A study such as this may raise anxieties in the patients and their families. It's therefore important for directors to discuss the nature of the study and the possible implications of the results with families before seeking their permission to participate. You may feel it would be desirable to obtain formal written consent from the individuals taking part in the study. If so, we suggest you use your own consent form for this purpose. It also might be appropriate to seek approval from your local ethical committee before embarking on the study. Clearly, it will not be possible to test all sexual and household contacts of all patients. Furthermore, you may have reservations about asking haemophiliacs to divulge details of sexual contacts. Even if you're unable to test all potential contacts, we'd welcome the return of any available data. Forms should be returned to Dr. Ritzer in an envelope marked confidential. Very last document, but then Professor Ludlam, before I ask you about this issue. HCDO 40271_087. This is Dr. Peter Jones again, 27th of November 1985, and we'll see he's writing here to reference centre directors as a whole. He says, as I shall be in America when the AIDS group meet next week, I'm writing to express my concern at how this survey is being conducted. And then he sets out various specific concerns about forms and so on. I'm not going to go through it paragraph by paragraph. If we go towards the bottom of the page, we'll pick it up in the last paragraph. In his covering letter to the directors, Dr. Forbes suggests that the ethical consent might be appropriate, but without a clear statement of the intent of this survey, local ethical committees face a difficult task. What the survey appears to be asking for is lists of the sexual and household contacts of haemophiliacs of whatever severity to be written down on the same form, thereby identifying families in smaller centres even without the use of names, and sent to Dr. Ritzer. From earlier discussion, it would appear that these confidential details will then be studied by at least further four people, and from the initials there, I think one of them is probably you, CL. And then if we go to the next page, and be processed either by hand or computer on at least 2 sites, Oxford and Manchester. No guidance is given, nor details asked about the type of anti-HTLV3 test in use, nor about the value of confirming a single positive result. And then Dr. Jones says this is shoddy stuff, and we should be ashamed to see it go out from an organisation that purports to care for people with haemophilia. And then he quotes from a Lancet leader on AIDS. and then says, if it continues without proper ethical and epidemiological guidance and without a free exchange of information with those at risk, this survey will fulfil Meyer's definition and make the more important sexual survey of risk factors proposed by Dr. Johnson extremely difficult, if not impossible, to conduct. So, Professor Ludlam, I wanted to show you all 4 of those just so that you saw how the exchange of correspondence went. First of all, looking at it broadly from a UK HCDO perspective, why did the UK HCDO consider it was part of its role as an organisation concerned with the care of people with haemophilia to gather information about the HTLV3 status of the partners and household contacts of haemophilia patients, whether they're HTLV3 positive or not?
Well, I think we were concerned, very concerned, about possibility of sexual transmission, and it was valuable to know how extensive this had been, or this was.
Why would you need, for that purpose, to have the HTLV3 status of household contacts, not those in a sexual relationship, and the HTLV3 status of partners and household contacts of haemophilia patients who were themselves negative?
Let me deal with the second question first about negative patients anti-HTLV3 negative. As this was at a time shortly after the introduction of the test, and we thought that probably people who were negative were not infected with the virus. We couldn't be absolutely certain. That's why we gave out the advice, as you know, that all patients should use, for example, contraceptive sheaths and assume that there could be sexual transmission. Your first question was about household contacts?
Yes, if your concern is about sexual transmission, why would you need data about household contacts?
Well, that's clearly not sexual transmission. That is a concern about household transmission within a household.
Did this survey go ahead?
No. I think you've seen the history of it. It was raised, I think, initially by me because of our concern, and I wanted to, for the organisation to think about the risks of sexual transmission. And I think it was Dr. Ritzer who drew up the forms. I only recently, I think, reminded of the forms. It was discussed at, I think, an AGM. It might have been perhaps it was the AGM in '85, and agreed. I fully understood the reservations and agreed with much of what Dr. Jones was saying in his correspondence and what is recorded in the minutes of the meeting, the one that he attended. And I think the forms were sent out, but I don't recall any of them being returned. Haemophilia Centre directors, as you see, were independent-minded people and most of them were quite sensible people, and saw that this was, particularly the way the forms have been set out, was going to be extremely difficult. I mean, I hadn't envisaged the results being sent in quite the way that Dr. Ritzer had set out the form. But it's a good example of haemophilia directors being a sensible group of physicians, if I can put it that way, seeing the problems of this and just not responding. and so the survey was never. I don't know whether Dr. Ritz got any forms back. Certainly, none came my way. I think the thing never got off the ground, and I think probably rightly so.
If it didn't get off the ground on a UK HCDO level, did you yourself seek to gather similar data in relation to the partners and household contacts of your patients?
Well, I think I indicated a day or two ago that we're very keen that sexual contacts were offered a test. Household contacts, we had one or two requests for household contacts, but the evidence was that it was not spread to non-sexual household contacts. So we didn't routinely encourage members of the family living in the same house to come forward. But as I say, we had one or two queries from people who were particularly concerned, and I remember one, I think there was a possible medical reason, and they were tested. So, but it wasn't a blanket policy. It wasn't a policy at all.
Other than in the circumstances in which you've described in relation to specifically undertaking HTLV3 tests for sexual contacts, over what period of time was blood taken or sought from the partners of haemophiliacs at the centre?
I think apart from the samples that we talked about that were taken initially for genetic tests, the samples that will be taken for anti-HCV3 testing for sexual contacts would go direct to virology. There wouldn't be any stored in hematology. It would just be a simple anti-HCV3 investigation, I presume. I imagine that you need to ask the virologist. I imagine they were stored there for a period.
Do you know whether, by the time you retired in 2011 from the Royal Infirmary, whether there were still serum samples from spouses or family members of bleeding disorder patients held in the hospital?
There would have been from patients, spouses, the samples from the genetic studies back in the mid-2000s, I suspect the need for those had long gone, and I suspect they were probably disposed of. Whether there were samples from patients, as far as I recall, still in existence in deep freezers when I retired, yes.
And just
was that the result? Did that answer your question?
Yes. Just before I move on to another topic, specifically again in relation to spouses or family members, you told us earlier in the week about the genetic testing. We looked at a letter which invited recipients to agree to have stored samples used for hepatitis testing. You've told us about HTLV3 testing. Are there any other purposes, research or otherwise, as far as you can recall, to which the samples of spouses and household contacts or family members were put?
I don't think they've been used. They may well have been thrown out. I'm sorry, I can't. I'm sure they weren't used.
Another completely different topic, Professor Ludlam. Want to cast your mind back to the first half of the 1980s and the relationship with Northern Ireland and with the Belfast Haemophilia Centre and Dr. Main. What do you know about the arrangements for SNBTS, Scotland, to supply Northern Ireland with blood products?
My recollection is that the blood transfusion service in Northern Ireland obviously collected the blood, separated the plasma, and sent the plasma to Edinburgh Protein Fractionation Centre for processing into blood components, blood products, like factor VIII and albumin and factor IX, possibly immunoglobulin, and that was returned to Northern Ireland, I think on a, if I can put it this way, a pro rata basis. In other words, they got back roughly the amount from the plasma that they supplied.
And was Scottish and Northern Irish plasma pooled?
I can't answer that question. You'd need to ask SNBTS.
Do you recall any discussions with Dr. Main from the first half of the 1980s about blood product safety and product usage?
She was, like the rest of us, was keen to keep patients on the same type of concentrate and not to switch between different sources, if I can put it that way, of concentrate. Like I've been keen to try and keep everyone on PFC, factor VIII. You raised the issue perhaps yesterday about batch dedication and the importance of trying to limit the donor exposure of patients. Dr. Main, I think, was had the same philosophy.
Your statement tells us that there came a point in 1988 in which there was a formal arrangement, I think the Factor VIII Working Party it was initially called, meetings of Haemophilia Centre Directors for Scotland and Northern Ireland to develop coordinated arrangements for haemophilia care. How did that come about and why?
The Coagulation Factor Working Party was established at the suggestion of Scottish Home and Health Department because there was a need to develop a new factor VIII concentrate for Scotland, one of higher purity, and the Scottish office, I think very sensibly, suggested that there should be discussions between the potential producers, SNBTS, and the users, we haemophilia directors, and that this needed to be taken forward reasonably rapidly. And so I was asked to chair a working party of key individuals in SNBTS, the Scottish office, and haemophilia directors. I chaired the meeting. There was Professor Lowe from Glasgow. There was Professor Cash, SNBTS, Dr. Perry from Protein Fractionation Centre, Dr. Keel from Scottish Home and Health. There was, I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name, a colleague from SNBTS who provided secretarial services for the group. And we met quite frequently, almost monthly, to consider the development of what kind of clotting factor concentrate should replace Z8, which was the one that was introduced in 1987 heat treated like the 8Y at 80 degrees for 72 hours.
Do you know whether any consideration was ever given to plasma from Wales being fractionated by SNBTS in a similar way to the arrangement with Northern Ireland?
I've never heard of that suggestion.
You've referred on a number of occasions to an archive, Professor Ludlam, your archive. Is that an archive within Edinburgh University, or is there some other kind of archive?
There are two archives, if I can put it that way. When I retired, I had received a year or two before a leaflet describing the Lothian Health Board archive, and they were keen to receive administrative material from individuals about their life and work in the hospital. I had files that went back over many years, some of which I thought covered quite interesting topics. And I asked the archive if they would be interested, and they seemed very enthusiastic. So I said, well, look, I can't be absolutely certain that there isn't any patient identifiable information in any of these. It's mostly about minutes of meetings and other such administrative documents, but there may be reference to patients, or there may have been things misfiled in the files. I said I can't be responsible for that, and they said, oh no, not to worry. They very carefully look through everything before they make it available. So I let them have what I could describe as administrative files, and they went off to the Lothian Health Board archive. After the Penrose inquiry concluded, I with assistance, because there's quite a lot of material, boxed up all the information I had in relation to haemophilia matters, and including information about the cohort, some of the original documentation that Dr. McClelland and I looked at to try and assess what had happened. I thought this was important information for all sorts of reasons, as very clear to the inquiry. All this was boxed up and stored, I don't know where it was stored, by the hospital, the Royal Infirmary. I retired. I don't know where they stored it, what they did with it, but it was securely stored. It was then conveyed, or I saw it first in the University of Edinburgh archive. I think it's probably where part of the Lothian Health Board archive is. Well, it is, as far as I know, stored there at the moment.
So just in terms of information that may be direct patient information, there may be some, or in fact there's likely to be some, in the material that you've referred to, which including the raw data that you and Dr. McClelland worked on, and that's material, that's documentation you handed over to the Royal Infirmary, so we would need to look to them to find the answer to that. The material that's held by the Lothian Health Board might also include some patient information. although you thought it was largely minutes and the like. Is that correct?
The second part is correct. The first part is the information in relation to haemophilia that I boxed up, if I can put it that way, after the Penrose inquiry. That is, as I understand it, is now in the university library in a very secure environment. I'm not quite sure whether it's formally part of the archive, Lothian Health Board archive, or whether it's being held on behalf of the hospital. You would need to ask the Royal Infirmary, I think. I presume they are the technical owners of the documentation.
Okay. You've referred and indeed been asked about interactions and meetings with the Scottish Home and Health Department. Do you know whether similar arrangements and meetings took place on a regular basis with other medical specialities, so non-haemophilia? Did you, for example, have similar arrangements to do with leukemia care?
Well, I wasn't, as you know, leading the leukemia service. I don't recall long-term meetings at Scottish Home and Health for, let's say, leukemia. There might have been a series of meetings in relation to particular topics, like bone marrow transplantation and resources. Where should resources be put for bone marrow transplantation in Scotland? So they would be, if I can put it this way, in response to a need, sort of project-based arrangements. I'm sorry, I've been out of it for a little while. I'm just trying to think of what other specialties might have had long-term relationships. I mean, I think I would say about, if I may, haemophilia care, historically, it has tended to be organised on a national basis, not just in the UK, but to some extent in other countries, because of its dependency on the blood transfusion service and its ability to produce cryoprecipitate. And so there needed to be coordination between the producers, the blood transfusion services, and the users, the haemophilia physicians and their patients. So there's a long history, and the World Federation of Haemophilia, run by the patients, is extremely successful, going into less well-developed countries with a program for developing haemophilia care, and part of their protocol is getting the blood transfusion services and the government and the patients and the patients' physicians all together to develop the arrangements.
I asked you earlier in the week, Professor, about your knowledge of the safety of the donor pool in Scotland and in particular the Edinburgh region. Did you know anything at the time of the Medicines Inspectorate report relating to the PFC in the early 80s?
I don't think I did, and even now I'm not sure I remember any of the detail. So I don't think I knew subsequently there had been, but I'm sorry, I don't think it didn't enter into, as far as I recall, part of my thinking in terms of working with SMBTS and PFC.
You told us about your policy of using domestic concentrates. considering them to be safer than imported concentrates. Do you accept, and were you aware when you were at the relevant time in the 80s, that given that these domestic concentrates were nonetheless pooled products, did you understand that the pool was only as safe as its least safe donor?
You see by my hesitation, it's quite a difficult question to answer. And it depends in what way the least safe donor is, in inverted commas, unsafe. If the unsafety is potentially damaged by the process of fractionation, then that isn't or may not be clinically important. The unsafe donor, if I can use that term, whatever's unsafe in that donation might be neutralized by antibodies, if assuming we'll think in terms of viruses, might be neutralized by antibodies in the provided by the rest of the donors. And parvovirus, I think, is an example of that, where a lot of us have antibodies to parvovirus, and that may neutralize the odd parvovirus positive donation. So there's, if you like, a built-in self-neutralizing arrangement. So that's why I'm slightly delayed in responding, because it's complex.
Perhaps a similar way of asking the question is this: did your loyalty to local concentrates lead you, do you think, to disregard the possibility of risks of viral transmission from the local pool?
If you're thinking of HTLV-3 and disregard, no. I appreciated there was a possibility, but I thought the chance was very small.
If we come on back to the question of information provided to patients and recorded about in their notes about risk, you said, I think, possibly on Tuesday, that you've been trained not to note things which were said to patients which were obvious. And you gave an example of there being nothing wrong with somebody's spleen, so you wouldn't record it. Why would it be obvious that you would have discussed the risks of treatment with patients and hence didn't need to record it in the notes?
Because it would be part of the general conversation in discussing the results, for example, from their previous visit, the hepatitis B results, the liver function tests, the blood count results, which can be abnormal in infections. It would be on that basis, and I think was generally believed and accepted by patients, that there were risks of virus transmission by concentrates.
What was the length of an average regular appointment in the first half of the 80s? It's been suggested to me to suggest to you that they were 10 to 15-minute appointments usually.
It would depend on the patient. Very, very variable. it might be a patient who had had few difficulties in the year, was feeling well, had hardly had any bleeds, might have had no bleeds. And we reviewed the results, and we would have, I would have reviewed how things were for him. He might have been only in seeing me for a quarter of an hour, perhaps. There might be other patients who have had difficulties during the previous few months, or who brought concerns to me, questions, and the occasion would go on much longer. I don't remember, and if there were times when I hardly remember any of these, one couldn't consider everything the patient wanted to talk about, or more likely as some medical issue arose that required a bit more thought and investigation, then they may well have had gone off for some investigations as seen on a further occasion, and one would have discussed it. But the review appointments, my recollection is they were for half-hour slots on the diary on my Tuesday afternoon clinic.
You've described the somewhat limited physical facilities at the centre, certainly in the earliest part of the 1980s. Where typically would the conversations with patients about risks or research or aid studies or whatever it might be, where would those conversations physically be taking place?
Those would take place either in the review clinics in the medical outpatient department, the Tuesday afternoon that I discussed, and they would also take place in the Haemophilia Centre room in Ward 23. Those are the most common. Occasionally patients came to the Department of Haematology. We had a small consulting room there, but that was pretty infrequent because there were a number of stairs up and down to get there, and that was difficult if you had haemophilia.
What efforts did you make in the discussions that you say you had with patients about risks and research and so on to ensure that they understood the explanation that you had given them?
I suppose just by their responses, and by their further questions.
Does that mean you would, as a matter of generality, assume they'd understood you unless, they physically looked puzzled or they asked you a question?
Perhaps I should say, if I felt I hadn't made myself clear, I would ask, do you understand this, or have I confused you, or can I put it a different way? I tried to, not only about viral infections, but any interaction with the patient. Part of the process is assessing the patient, is understanding what I am saying, and trying to check it out if I don't think it's going right. That's part of what a consultation is.
Sir, I've been over an hour, Council's estimate as ever. I don't expect to be another hour, but I'm going to be more than another few minutes. I don't know whether Professor Ludlam would like a break before we complete his evidence, or whether he wishes to continue, or what you would like.
Perhaps you can give him some sense of what few might be.
Possibly 20 minutes, half an hour, I'd say.
Professor, would you like a break or would you like to continue?
Could I have a short break?
Certainly.
My mental ability is not like it used to be, I'm afraid. I get slower as the day goes on. A cup of tea and a biscuit, I think, will improve the quality of my responses.
Well, what, 15 minutes do you think would do it? Would you like longer? 15?
Professor Ludlam, is 15 minutes sufficient?
15 minutes is fine for me, thank you.
So 20 to 4 in that case. 20 to 4.